Hey guys, so imagine you're walking into a Roman home, not some modest apartment wedged between others in the city, but a real house, the kind with an atrium, with slaves carrying things, with the smell of expensive spices wafting through every corridor. You're not there by accident, you've been invited, and as you step inside, something catches the light. It gleams. It's colorful in a way that shouldn't be possible. It's glass. Not just any glass either. The kind that glows like liquid rubies or emeralds or the pale blue of a summer sky. And suddenly you understand something. You understand that the person who brought you here isn't just wealthy. They're telling you something without saying a single word. So before we dive into the silent language of Roman luxury, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Because honestly, this stuff about how people showed off in the ancient world is genuinely fascinating. And if you've ever wondered what wealth actually looked like before credit cards and designer labels, well, you're about to find out. Let me turn down the lights here. Maybe get comfortable because we're about to step into the glittering world of Roman glass and uncover why a simple drinking cup could tell you more about a person's status than their entire wardrobe. When you think about ancient Rome, you might picture marble statues, gold coins, purple togas, all the obvious symbols of wealth that make it into the history books. But if you really want to understand Roman society, if you want to know what separated the truly wealthy from everyone else, you need to look at something far more subtle. Something that caught the light and made you realize instantly that you were in the presence of someone important. Glass, not modern glass. Ancient Roman glass was something else entirely. It was rare. It was exotic. It was so difficult to make that the people who could afford it were basically announcing their wealth to anyone who walked through their door. And here's the thing that's wild about it. Nobody had to tell you the person was rich. You just knew. The moment you saw it, your brain registered the message. This person has money. This person has access to things most people can't even imagine. This person is important. It was a silent language spoken in every Roman home where wealth meant power. Think about it from the perspective of someone visiting a wealthy Roman's home for the first time. You walk in, your eyes adjusting to the light filtering through the atrium. Everything is impressive, sure. There's the architecture, the marble floors, the decorated walls. But then you see it. A table laid out for dinner. And on that table, arranged with careful consideration, are vessels that absolutely gleam. Not pottery, not wood, not even simple metal cups. These are made of something that looks almost liquid, that catches the light and seems to glow from within. That's when you know. This isn't just a successful merchant or a moderately wealthy aristocrat. This is someone at the top of the pyramid. Someone whose wealth is so secure, so established, that they can spend it on something as beautiful and as fragile as glass. Let's start with the most obvious question. Why was glass so rare? Why did it cost more than some houses? Well, it's because making it required something that absolutely couldn't be faked or rushed. Knowledge, technology, and honestly, a willingness to spend hours getting it exactly right. For most of human history, glass was practically impossible to make. People knew that if you heated sand hot enough, you could turn it into something clear and hard. But the temperatures you needed were insane. You're talking about furnaces that could reach nearly 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Building a furnace like that, heating it consistently, maintaining that heat long enough to actually transform sand into molten glass. That wasn't something you just figured out in your backyard. It took specialized craftsmen. It took trial and error. It took the kind of infrastructure that only really wealthy people or strong states could afford to develop. The process was dangerous too. Glassmakers worked near roaring furnaces in oppressive heat. One mistake, and you could ruin an entire batch of glass, wasting hours of fuel and materials. The skill was passed down through families, guarded carefully. Glassmaking families were like the tech entrepreneurs of the ancient world. They had proprietary knowledge. They had techniques that worked. And they absolutely weren't sharing those secrets with just anyone. And then, around the 1st century BC, something changed. Somebody, and we're not entirely sure who, figured out how to blow glass. Imagine this. You have molten glass on the end of a long, hollow pipe. You put it in your mouth and you blow. Gentle, controlled, careful. The glass expands. It forms a bubble. You can shape it while it's still hot. You can create thin-walled vessels that are delicate, beautiful, almost impossible to achieve any other way. This innovation, glass blowing, revolutionized the whole industry. Suddenly, you could make more glass faster. You could produce more varied shapes. You could create things that were thinner, more elegant, more beautiful. But it was still expensive. It was still difficult. It still required skill and heat and resources. The blowing technique itself demanded a special kind of strength and coordination. You had to understand the exact stage of the glass, when it was hot enough to expand, but not so hot that it became too fluid. You had to know how hard to blow, how long to blow, when to stop. And that made the whole process perfect for what it ally became in Roman society. The ultimate status symbol. Because even though production became more efficient, even though more glass could be made, it was still rare enough, still difficult enough, still impressive enough that owning it meant something. Now here's where it gets interesting. Glass in Rome came in different colors, and the color told you something about where it came from and how much someone had paid for it. The cheapest glass, relatively speaking, was clear glass. Not because it was easy to make, but because clear glass required fewer special ingredients. It was still expensive by normal standards, still something only wealthy people could afford. But if you had servants and slaves and owned property, you could probably get some clear glass vessels. Maybe a drinking cup or two, a small bowl, nothing too extravagant. But then you had the colored glass. Oh, the colored glass. This is where things got really expensive, where you entered the realm of truly serious wealth. You wanted dark blue glass. You needed cobalt. Cobalt wasn't just lying around. It had to be sourced from specific locations, traded across long distances, and it was rare enough that prices reflected that scarcity. There's cobalt in Egypt, some in Afghanistan, some in sources that were available through trade routes, but only to people with the right connections. Purple glass? That required gold or even more exotic materials. Some of the deepest, richest purples that archaeologists have found in Roman excavations literally have gold mixed into the glass. We're talking about drinking cups that contained precious metal as a decorative element in the glass itself, just to show off the color. The financial calculation here is staggering. You're not just paying for the glass, you're paying for gold. Gold mixed into something that's meant to be drunk from. That's not practical. That's not logical. That's pure, concentrated display of wealth. Red glass was particularly prized, and here's something interesting about it. Actually making red glass properly was so difficult that even rich Romans often had red glass that wasn't as vibrant as they would have liked. It required careful control of the furnace temperature and the addition of copper compounds. Get the temperature wrong, and the red doesn't develop properly. The chemistry has to be exact. Sometimes potters and glassmakers would layer red glass over clear glass to make the red appear deeper and richer. It was essentially a trick, but a very expensive trick. You were creating the illusion of deeper color by using more material, more skill, more time. It was fraudulent in a way, except it wasn't, because everyone knew what was happening, and everyone accepted it as part of the game. The person who owned it knew they were getting a visual effect that took extra work to achieve. They were paying for that extra work. Then you had the truly rare colors: amber glass, emerald green glass, translucent white glass that looked almost like porcelain, glass that seemed to glow from within, glass that caught the light and refused to let it go. Each one sent a different message. Each one required different knowledge, different materials, different effort. Holding a cup of emerald glass at a dinner party was basically saying, I don't just have money, I have access to materials you've never even seen. I have connections across the Mediterranean. I have the kind of wealth that can absorb the cost of this beautiful, impractical thing. I can afford to own something that serves no practical purpose beyond looking incredible. The richest Romans would have entire collections of colored glass, different colors for different occasions, the way modern people might have a wardrobe of clothes for different events. Think about what glassware actually was in a Roman home. It wasn't just practical vessels. Well, I mean, it was, but it was also much more than that. Glasses, cups, drinking vessels, bowls, storage jars. These things held wine, held water, held delicacies, but they also held meaning. When you hosted a dinner in ancient Rome, the meal itself was important, sure. The food mattered, but what really mattered was how you presented it. And the vessels you used to present that food and drink, they were making a statement about you that was heard by every single guest. Roman banquets, symposia as they were sometimes called, were elaborate affairs. They weren't just about eating. They were social events, political events, moments where alliances were made and status was confirmed. The host's job wasn't just to provide good food. It was to create an experience that said something about their position in society. Wine was served in glass cups called chalices. Drinking from glass rather than ceramic or metal made the experience feel more refined, more luxurious. You could see the color of the wine more clearly through glass. If it was a fine wine, glass showed it off better. Water and other beverages might be served in glass as well, or in elaborate glass mixing vessels. Food was sometimes presented in glass bowls. Delicacies, expensive imported items, would be served in the most beautiful containers the host could afford. Imagine the scene. The host brings out wine in ordinary ceramic cups. Functional, practical, boring. Everyone around the table registers it immediately. They understand what it means. This person, while wealthy enough to host a dinner, isn't quite at the top tier of the social hierarchy. Now imagine a different scenario. The same host brings out wine in a glass vessel that shimmers in the lamplight, clear and brilliant, or deep jewel-toned. The color seems to glow from within. The light passes through it in a way that ceramic can never match. Suddenly, the wine tastes better, or at least your brain thinks it does. The presentation elevates everything. The host isn't just serving wine. The host is serving you an experience wrapped in luxury, and every guest at that table understands this immediately. Some of them are jealous. Some of them are impressed. Some of them are calculating exactly how much that cup probably cost. Some are thinking about how this host is clearly superior to other hosts they've dined with because this host has glass. The glassware was part of the dinner party choreography. It was part of the show, and the host knew it. They had probably planned it carefully. Maybe they had ordered specific pieces made for this particular dinner. Or maybe they were bringing out their most prized possessions, the pieces they normally kept stored away for important occasions. The Romans understood what we call visual communication, though they didn't use that term. They understood that what people saw when they walked into your home told a story about who you were. And glassware told that story in the most elegant, understated way possible. It whispered. It didn't shout. You didn't have to say, "I'm rich." Your glassware said it for you. It was the ultimate subtle flex. Here's what's fascinating about glass as a status symbol compared to other forms of wealth display. Gold and jewelry were obvious. Everybody knows gold is valuable. Slaves were obvious. If you had a lot of them, everyone could count them and understand what that meant. Land was obvious, though of course you had to actually visit the property to verify it. But glass? Glass operated on a different level. It required knowledge to truly appreciate it. You had to understand that the color alone meant something. You had to know that clear glass was harder to make than it looked. You had to recognize that a particular shade of blue came from cobalt, which came from distant places, which cost money to trade for and transport. Glass was a luxury for people who were educated enough to understand why it was a luxury. It was wealth with an intellectual component. It was the kind of thing that said, not only am I rich, but I'm sophisticated enough to spend my money on things that matter aesthetically and intellectually. I'm not some crude merchant who just buys the biggest and loudest things. I have taste. I understand value beyond the obvious. And to other educated Romans, that message came through loud and clear. The production of Roman glass was concentrated in specific locations, and this created an entire economy around luxury items. The glass-making centers were in Egypt, particularly around Alexandria, in the eastern Mediterranean, and later in some parts of the Italian peninsula. But the best stuff, the most desirable glass, came from the east. Alexandria was legendary for the quality of its glass. It had been a center of learning, of trade, of cultural exchange. The glassmakers there understood their craft in ways that glassmakers in other places simply didn't. They had access to the best raw materials. They had developed techniques that produced the most beautiful colors and the most perfect clarity. And that meant it had to be transported. It had to be traded through networks that included merchants, middlemen, ship captains, and probably a few pirates along the way. This created what we might call a luxury supply chain, probably one of the most complex and profitable supply chains of the ancient world. Glass vessels were packed carefully into ships, wrapped in cloth probably, protected from breaking during the journey. Imagine the logistics. You're a merchant. You've bought glass from glassmakers in Alexandria or somewhere else in the eastern Mediterranean. Now you have to get it to Rome, or to Britain, or to anywhere else in the empire where wealthy Romans want to buy it. The voyage itself is dangerous. Storms, pirates, accidents. If your ship goes down, your entire investment is lost. If the glass breaks during transport, you lose money. So you have to be very careful. You have to charge enough to cover your risk. They made their way across the Mediterranean, stopping at various ports, being traded and retraded until they finally ended up in the homes of wealthy Romans far from where they were made. And every step of that journey added cost. every person who touched that glass vessel, every merchant who took a cut, every ship captain who jid for passage, the port authorities taking their percentage, all of it added to the final price. By the time luxury-colored glass reached the home of a wealthy Roman in Britain or Gaul, it had been handled by dozens of people and traveled thousands of miles. When a Roman aristocrat had glass from Alexandria, they weren't just displaying the object. They were displaying proof of access to complex international trade networks. They were displaying the cost of maintaining those networks. They were displaying that they were important enough, wealthy enough, well-connected enough, that such things would flow to their home. Glass was geopolitical power made visible. It was proof that you existed within the Roman system in a position of importance. It was proof that the machinery of empire turned in your favor. But here's something important. Not all glass was equally inaccessible. By the later Roman period, by the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, glass production had become more efficient. More furnaces existed. The technology had spread beyond just a few exclusive workshops. And while glass was still expensive, it was less impossibly expensive than it had been in the earliest days of the Roman Empire. So you started to get stratification within glass ownership itself. The truly wealthy had the rare colors, the darker blues, the purples, the reds, the emeralds. They had thick-walled vessels with perfect clarity and brilliant colors. Their collections might include dozens of pieces, each one carefully selected, each one more beautiful than the last. The really, really wealthy might have had entire rooms dedicated to storing their glassware, bringing it out only for the most important occasions. On the other end of the spectrum, people of moderate means could sometimes afford to own a piece or two of clear glass. Maybe if they did well in business, if they had made some money, if they wanted to signal that they were moving up in society. It was still expensive for them, still represented a significant purchase, but it was possible. For a merchant or someone with a skilled trade, buying a single glass cup might have represented a week or two of income. It was an investment in status, and this created an interesting dynamic. If you had clear glass, you were displaying a certain level of wealth. Visitors would see it and understand something. This person has money. This person is successful. This person is above the common people. But if someone else walked in with colored glass, particularly rare colors, well, they were clearly a step above you on the social ladder. Not just wealthier, but with better connections and access to rarer luxuries. It was wealth signaling in the most subtle, most effective way possible. No one had to compare prices. No one had to ask how much anything cost. You just looked at it and you understood. You didn't even have to know the exact price to understand the hierarchy. You just had to know that more vibrant colors cost more money. More skilled work cost more money. Clarity and perfection of form cost more money. And everyone in Roman society understood that intuitively. A child could look at glass and understand something about the owner's position in society. The color of the glass was like wearing a badge of rank. The irony, and there's something kind of beautiful about this, is that glass is fundamentally fragile. Unlike gold, which lasts forever, which can be melted down and remade and preserved indefinitely, glass breaks. You have a beautiful emerald glass cup, and someone bumps the table wrong, and it shatters. All that money, all that effort, all that display of wealth, gone in an instant. The impermanence of it is kind of shocking when you think about it. You've spent a fortune on something that could be destroyed in a moment of carelessness. Maybe that's why Romans kept a lot of it in storage, in the triclinium, in special rooms dedicated to showing off what they owned, but not actually using it constantly. Or maybe that fragility was part of the point. It demonstrated that you had so much money that you could afford to own beautiful things that might break. You could afford to buy it again. You could afford the risk. You could afford to replace it without it affecting your life in any significant way. The concept of owning fragile, temporary luxury items was itself a luxury. Poor people couldn't afford fragile things. They couldn't afford to break something valuable. They had to own objects that were durable, practical, survivable, but wealthy people could own delicate, beautiful things. Wealthy people could afford to lose them. Wealthy Romans knew that having delicate, fragile objects scattered throughout their homes sent a specific message. I am secure enough in my wealth that I can own things that are temporary. I can own things that might be destroyed. I can own things that have no practical purpose, and I don't need to worry about replacing them. That message was as important, maybe more important, than the object itself. The Roman economy operated very differently from modern ones, but the principle of status signaling through consumption was essentially the same. People wanted to demonstrate their position in society. They wanted to make clear to others what level of wealth and power they occupied. And they did this through visible displays. Clothing did some of this work. The color of your toga, the quality of the fabric, who could afford certain dyes. Jewelry did this work. Architecture did this work. The size and decoration of your home, the location, the rooms you had. But glass was special because it required multiple types of knowledge to fully appreciate. You had to understand trade. You had to understand production. You had to understand color and materials. You had to understand furnaces and temperature and the chemistry of turning sand into liquid. Glass was wealth that proclaimed its own sophistication, and as Roman civilization spread, as the empire expanded, glass became one of those items that traveled along with Roman power. Roman soldiers got stationed in distant places, and Romans who wanted to feel connected to the empire, who wanted to feel part of that cosmopolitan culture, would seek out Roman glass. Merchants in outlying territories would stock it because it brought status to their clients. Glass became a vector of cultural transmission. It wasn't just a luxury item. It was a symbol of belonging to something larger. If you had genuine Roman glass, you were declaring yourself part of the Roman world. You were saying, I matter. I'm part of the empire. I have access to its goods and its culture. I'm not some provincial nobody. I'm connected to Rome, and Rome is connected to me. Glass was how you announced your place in the cosmopolitan network of the Roman world. It was how you said that you participated in something bigger than your local community. And that meant everything. By the time the Roman Empire started to decline, by the time the political and military structures that had held it together began to fracture, glass was so embedded in the idea of Roman luxury and Roman civilization that it became one of the lasting legacies of that world. Medieval Europeans found Roman glass in ruins and treasured it. They didn't necessarily understand how to make it. The technology had been lost. The furnaces had cooled. The glassmakers had died or disappeared. But they knew it was valuable. They knew it was ancient. They knew it represented a world that had been more sophisticated, more luxurious, more connected than their own. And so Roman glass became a kind of ghost, a beautiful, gleaming ghost of a civilization that had understood how to turn sand into light, how to transport that light across oceans, how to use it to tell the world who they were. When someone at a Roman dinner party reached for a goblet of dark blue glass, held it up to the lamplight so it glowed like a jewel, and took a sip of wine, they were doing more than drinking. They were participating in a language that had been centuries in the making. They were announcing themselves to the world. They were confirming their place in a hierarchy that everyone understood without anyone needing to speak about it. That's the power of the silent signal. That's why glassware mattered so much. It whispered what the owner wanted the world to know. And in a society where so much was about knowing your place, about understanding the unspoken rules, about reading the subtle signals that told you who was above you and who was below, glassware was one of the clearest, most beautiful of those signals. In the light of a Roman dining room, reflected in the surface of a glass cup, you could see exactly where you stood in the world. And everyone at that table saw it too. That's the real genius of it. That's why the Romans understood that a choice as simple as what your glassware was made of could be a silent sign of everything.